On January 2, 2010, a cold front settled over South Florida and did not lift for 9 days, and by the time it broke, dead Burmese pythons were lying in canals across the Everglades. Biologists had 10 under radio tracking. 9 were dead. Some had crawled into the open to bask instead of going underground. That freeze is the best evidence that cold will hold this snake inside Florida. But the ones that lived through it were not the same genetically as the ones that went in, and what changed in them is why this is not settled. Those 10 were only the tracked animals. Researchers with the U.S. Geological Survey and the University of Florida also followed the fate of 99 other pythons through the same 9 days, snakes carrying no transmitters, and 59 of those came through alive. So the honest range for that freeze is somewhere between 40 and 90% of the population dead, depending on which group you count. That is the spread behind every headline you have ever read about the winter that nearly wiped out Florida's pythons. On the ground, it looked like exactly what it was. Dead pythons in the canals along the levee roads, in the sawgrass, on the shoulders of Tamiami Trail, in the water conservation areas north of Everglades National Park. Biologists collected them and wrote it up as cold-induced mortality, and for a while that paper read like the end of the argument. The Burmese python is a tropical animal, and for 9 days South Florida was not a tropical place. The mechanism is not complicated. A Burmese python is an ectotherm, which means it has no internal furnace. Its body temperature is whatever its surroundings give it. Below a certain point, the animal cannot digest, cannot move well enough to reach cover, and its immune system stops working properly. So a snake that survives a bad week often dies of the pneumonia it picks up in the month after. Push it far enough down and the organs shut off. Acute hypothermia. That is what the Everglades necropsies showed in 2010, and it is why every serious argument about how far north this snake can go is really an argument about a handful of nights per winter. What nobody expected was that the freeze would leave a signature you could still read 8 years later. In 1918, a research team led by Castoe at the University of Texas at Arlington published a study in the journal Molecular Ecology. They had tissue from Florida pythons collected before the 2010 freeze and tissue from Florida pythons collected after it. Same invasion, same swamp, 2 snapshots with a catastrophe in between. They scanned the genome looking for regions where the frequency of genetic variants had shifted further than random chance could explain. They found them, and the shifts were not scattered evenly across the genome. They clustered in regions carrying genes associated with thermosensation, with behavior, with physiology, and with the regenerative organ growth that lets a python's gut and heart swell and shrink around a meal. The technical term for that pattern is directional selection, and it means something specific. It means the deaths were not random. When a freeze takes most of a population arbitrarily, the survivors are a smaller version of the same population and the genome barely moves. That is not what the Arlington team found. Whatever let those particular animals live through those 9 days is what the next generation of Everglades pythons was built out of, which raises the only question that matters. How far did the needle actually move? In 2023, the U.S. Geological Survey published a full synthesis of the Burmese python invasion, pulling together 2 decades of biology, impacts, and management. Buried in it is a line that reads like an afterthought and is not one. The report states there is evidence that evolutionary change has already altered parts of the genome responsible for cold tolerance, and that pythons may be able to tolerate climatic conditions farther north than the area where the population is currently established. That is a federal agency in a technical document saying the ceiling has moved. If you want the version of this with the dates and the counties and the actual papers in it instead of the easy version, that is what this channel is for. Subscribe and you will not miss one, and tell me in the comments which county you are watching from and whether anything has turned up near you that had no business being there. State and animal. That map gets drawn by the people living on it. Now that 2023 line landed the way it did because of a fight that started 15 years earlier, and to see why that fight mattered, you need to know how big the thing being argued about had already gotten. The version of this story that made it into every documentary is Hurricane Andrew. August 1992, a Category 5 storm comes across South Miami-Dade, flattens a reptile breeding facility, and scores of Burmese pythons go out into the wetlands. That did happen, and it is still not the origin of the invasion. Burmese pythons were being found loose in South Florida as early as 1979, 13 years before Andrew, and the genetic work points to several separate introduction events rather than one. Analysis of Florida's pythons has turned up evidence of a second introduction to the West near Naples, and of animals carrying Indian python DNA mixed in, which is a different species entirely and not something one wrecked warehouse explains. What actually built this population was the pet trade, running for decades. People bought a snake the length of their forearm, and 4 years later it was 12 feet long and eating rabbits, and some of them drove it out to a canal bank and let it go. Enough people did that in a subtropical wetland with year-round prey and no natural enemy for an adult constrictor that by 2000 there were multiple generations breeding in Everglades National Park across a large area. That is the established invasion, already a decade deep, with several generations of American-born snakes on the ground. The 2010 freeze hit that population, which is exactly what made the projections so alarming. In 2008, two USGS researchers, Gordon Rada and Robert Reed, ran a climate-matching analysis on the Burmese python. The method is simple in principle. You take the climate of the animal's native range across South and Southeast Asia, you take the climate of the United States, and you find the places where those two overlap. The map that came out of it covered the southern third of the continental United States, the Gulf Coast, coastal Georgia and the Carolinas, most of Texas, a band running west into Southern California. That map went everywhere. It ran in newspapers with a python coiled over half the country, and it is the single image most responsible for what people in Alabama and Georgia and Louisiana think about this animal. And the reasoning behind it was not made up. The Burmese python's native range is not purely tropical. It runs north through Myanmar and into parts of southern China, and west across northern India and the lowlands of Nepal, country that sits well outside the tropics and gets genuinely cool in winter. Somewhere in this species range, snakes are already dealing with cold months and coming out the other side. That is the honest core of the Rada and Reed argument, and anyone who waves the whole projection away as scaremongering has not read it. It still got challenged almost immediately in a peer-reviewed journal by scientists who thought the method was wrong. Later that same year, a rebuttal appeared in PLOS 1 from a team led by the herpetologist Alexander Pyron. They ran ecological niche models on the same snake using 19 climate variables instead of a handful, including measures of climatic extremes and seasonal variation rather than averages alone. Their conclusion was the opposite. The only suitable habitat for Burmese pythons in the United States, they found, is southern Florida and a sliver of extreme southern Texas. Nothing else. The disagreement sounds technical, and it is not. It comes down to how you summarize a winter, average the whole season together, and Savannah, Georgia looks survivable for a python. Look instead at the coldest week that city has recorded in 30 years, and the snake is dead somewhere inside it. It is the same city both times. What changes is which question you asked it. And that single methodological choice is what separates a map covering a third of the country from a map covering the bottom of one state. And if you have watched this far, the obvious objection has probably already occurred to you. If pythons can push north, where are they? Where are the wild breeding pythons in Georgia, in Alabama, in the Carolinas? It is the right question, and somebody went and answered it in the most direct way available. Michael Dorcas and a team of colleagues took 10 Burmese pythons from the established South Florida population and moved them to a semi-natural enclosure at the Savannah River Ecology Laboratory near Aiken, South Carolina. The enclosure sat outdoors on real South Carolina ground, fenced with vegetation, standing water, and artificial dens the snakes could crawl into whenever they wanted. Then they waited for winter. Several of the pythons died during a sub-freezing stretch without ever moving into shelter. They were found lying in the open. The remaining snakes did use the refuges, and they died anyway during the unusually cold period in January 2010, the same cold snap that was killing pythons hundreds of miles south in the Everglades. 10 snakes went into that enclosure, and none of them came out alive. Necropsies showed acute hypothermia, with no sign of disease and no respiratory infection to blame it on. That is about as clean an answer as this question is ever going to get. The current generation of Florida Burmese pythons cannot survive a South Carolina winter. Not in theory, not in a model. They were given the dens, and they still died. So the cold barrier is real, not enough to confirm the northward spread. But read those two studies against each other and something uncomfortable falls out. And it is the part almost nobody says out loud. Look at how the snakes died. In South Carolina, several of them were sitting in the open during sub-freezing weather with usable shelter a short crawl away. In the Everglades, tracked pythons came out to bask in the middle of a 9-day freeze, which is the worst possible decision an ectotherm can make in that situation. In both places, a meaningful share of the mortality came down to where the animals chose to be, rather than to the outright limits of their tissue. A native temperate snake does not do that. A timber rattlesnake in the Appalachians reads shortening daylight and falling soil temperature and moves into a hibernaculum weeks before the first hard freeze and stays there. That is not learned behavior. No adult rattlesnake taught it. It is instinct, and instinct is written into the genome the same way scale color is, which means the wall holding this animal inside South Florida is not only a question of how cold a python's body can get before it fails. A large part of it is that the snake does not know what to do when the cold arrives. And that is the category the Arlington genome scan lit up. Not scale thickness, not metabolic rate, thermosensation and behavior, the wiring that tells the animal what the temperature is doing and when to get underground. A barrier made of behavior is a lot softer than a barrier made of physiology because behavior is the fastest thing natural selection can edit. It does not require a new organ. It requires the snakes that stayed out to stop breeding, and every hard freeze in South Florida arranges that automatically. The 2010 event ran that experiment across the whole population at once. Smaller cold snaps have run it repeatedly since. Here is where the honesty has to hold. Nobody has demonstrated a Florida Burmese python surviving a Carolina winter. There is no published measurement showing the population's lethal low temperature has dropped by a specific number of degrees. What exists is a signal in the genome, a federal report saying that signal touches cold tolerance, and a field experiment from an earlier generation of snakes that says no. Not enough to confirm, not enough to dismiss. The reason any of this is worth your time is what has already been documented inside the range they do hold. In 2012, a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences laid out the results of systematic road surveys through Everglades National Park. Researchers drove 56,971 kilometers of park roads between 2003 and 2011, counting mammals, and compared what they found against Directional survey work done in 1996 and 1997, before pythons were widespread. Raccoons were down 99.3%, opossums 98.9%, bobcats 87.5%, marsh rabbits, cottontail rabbits, and foxes were not detected at all on the recent routes, in a park where all three had been ordinary a decade earlier. And the collapse was steepest in the southernmost sections of the park, the ground where pythons had been established the longest. If you have driven the park road at night, you know what that means in practice. There used to be eyes in the headlights the whole way. Raccoons on the shoulder, rabbits breaking across the asphalt, a bobcat crossing at the edge of the beam. Now people drive the same road and see almost nothing move. That is the finished product of a python invasion, and it happened in a national park, under observation, in about 15 years, and the ceiling on what they take keeps moving. In December 2022, biologists with the Conservancy of Southwest Florida found a female python in the woods near Naples in the middle of swallowing a full-grown white-tailed deer. The snake measured 14.8 feet and weighed 115 pounds. The deer weighed 77 pounds, which is roughly 67% of the snake's own body mass, and the Conservancy believes it is the largest prey-to-predator ratio ever documented for this species, possibly for any python. Follow-up work by that same team on python jaw structure found that the largest individuals can take adult deer and alligators whole. Sit with that for a second if you hunt. Every county in the southeast is managed around deer. The entire economy of rural land access in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and the Carolinas runs on a whitetail population that landowners count, feed, and plan their year around. The Everglades already shows what an unchecked constrictor does to raccoons and rabbits. Southwest Florida is now showing what the large females do to deer. That is the actual stake in the range question. And it is why people in Baker County, Georgia, and Mobile County, Alabama, keep asking about a few degrees of January weather. So the obvious response is to go get them, and Florida does, harder every year. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates the Greater Everglades holds tens of thousands of Burmese pythons, and states plainly that no precise count is possible. The reason is the animal itself. A pattern of tan and brown blotches in sawgrass and cypress shadow is functionally invisible, and a python that is not moving is a python nobody finds, including trained searchers walking directly past it. In July of 2025, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission ran its annual Florida Python Challenge across 10 days and 8 locations, including Everglades National Park for the first time. 934 people registered from 30 states and Canada. They removed 294 pythons, the most in the event's history. The top hunter took 60 of them by herself. The more effective work is quieter. The Conservancy of Southwest Florida runs a scout snake program, radio tagging male pythons and following them to the breeding aggregations where the large females are. Between November 2025 and April 2026, working across roughly 200 square miles of Southwest Florida, that team removed 177 pythons weighing 8,080 pounds, 4 tons of snake in one season, the highest total biomass since the program started in 2013. The largest female measured 17 feet and weighed 153 pounds. The average female came in around 95 pounds and carried about 70 eggs, which means that single season kept an estimated 4,100 python eggs out of the Everglades. That is the best removal season on record, and nobody involved in it claims the population is shrinking. What those numbers describe is a line being held at the western edge of the invasion at enormous cost by a small number of people, which brings up the question every viewer outside Florida actually wants answered. Has one ever turned up somewhere else? Once, clearly. In late 2011, a man found a 12-foot Burmese python alive and loose near Notchaway Creek in South Georgia. It was captured and sent to a park in Albany, where the staff named it Notchaway, and it lived out its life as an exhibit animal. But it proves nothing about range expansion. One snake, no second animal, no nest, no clutch of eggs, in a state where Burmese pythons were sold as pets for decades. Biologists attributed it to a released or escaped captive, and that is almost certainly what it was. But hold that case up next to everything else in this video, because there is a problem inside it. If Florida's pythons ever do start pushing north, the first individual found in Georgia will look exactly like Notchaway did. One large snake, alone, in a creek bottom, in a state full of former pet owners. There will be no way to tell the two situations apart until somebody finds a second animal or a nest, which means the detection system for the thing everyone is worried about is guaranteed to miss the beginning of it. Go back to those 9 days in January 2010. The canals full of dead snakes, the tracked animals lying out in the open where the cold found them, the biologists walking the levee roads, counting bodies. That freeze did exactly what everyone said it would do, and it remains the strongest single argument that this animal is contained. But it did a second thing at the same time. It removed most of a population and kept the ones that happened to behave differently. And 8 years later, a genome scan could still see the shape of the survivors in the DNA. None of that guarantees a breeding python in Georgia. Cold is still a real barrier. The enclosure near Aiken is still 10 dead snakes, and no measurement anywhere shows this population surviving a winter it could not survive before. What has changed is that the barrier is not a fixed line anymore. It is a test run against the population every few winters, and each round of it leaves the survivors a little better matched to the next one. The question was never really whether a python can endure a night at 25 degrees. It is whether enough of them will learn to go underground before that night arrives, in the only way a snake learns anything at all, which is by having the ones who got it wrong taken out of the gene pool. South Florida has been teaching that lesson, one freeze at a time, for 16 years.